let's do a deeper dive into the literary fairy tales you read for this week. We've already started that with Anne Duggan's TED Talk, but let's go even further. So the first two fairy tales that we looked at were by Perrault and the Grimms. They're canonical fairy tales. They've been immortalized in centuries of children's fairy tale collections. They probably informed versions of Red Riding Hood that you grew up with, whether you heard them or you read them for yourself. But the audience for these fairy tales was not always children, and the intended audience really shapes our understanding of the message, the purpose, the social role that these fairy tales play. So, Perrault was writing to an explicitly adult audience, and his tales include very encoded euphemisms like to see a wolf, which was sometimes used as French slang for a girl losing her virginity. When you are writing that tale to other adults, that sexualized meaning and the implicit message with it is taken in a different way. But what about when we give it to kids? So unlike Perrault, the Grimms write and rewrite their literary fairy tales, beginning in 1812 and ending around 1857. And one of the biggest catalysts for these revisions are letters they get from parents. See, in 1812, the Grimms didn't set out to write children's stories. They saw themselves as collecting folklore. However, when they start getting letters back from parents complaining about the content of the stories, saying, I sat down to read this to my kid and I had to shut the book because I couldn't say that out loud, they suddenly realized that the target audience needed to change. The way that they were going to make money was writing to children. See, they had written books before this, but their text on the evolution of Germanic languages hadn't been a bestseller. When they realized that they can make money, they pursue it. And it fit with what was going on in Germany at the time, because you see, Germany, or the land that we now identify as Germany on our maps, was prior to 1800, places like Kingdom of Saxony, Bavaria, Hanover, Prussia. And the citizens were citizens of these entities. But after the Napoleonic Wars, they sat down and drew new outlines on their maps and slapped a new nation across it, Germany. And so German citizens in the 1800s, are trying to work out what it means to be German citizens. And these fairy tales get swept up in that, because they become not only edited for parents' approval, but edited for expressing, perhaps indoctrinating, emerging cultural norms. We're not going to get further into that, though if you want to pursue that in a research paper, you could look at things that have been written by Zipes, but we are going to look at it in the two variations of the ending that we had on Sur la Lune. In the 1812 version of the Grimm's tale, Little Red Cap, we see that there are two encounters with the wolf. The first ends with the huntsman freeing the grandma and Red Riding Hood, but the wolf then comes back. And the grandmother realizes that they are being stalked, and so she comes up with a plan, and she gets Red Riding Hood to help her in outwitting and defeating the wolf for good. Why would this ending be cut out? It doesn't have anything sexualized or inappropriate. This was cut out for cultural reasons, and that in the 19th century, the German ideal of femininity is becoming increasingly passive and increasingly silent. And so we see actions and agency being taken away from the heroines in the Grimm's collections. People like Cinderella, Snow White, get fewer and fewer speaking parts to demonstrate that they are good women, while as witches, evil stepmothers speak even more in later adaptations. And actions that are taken by these characters, like Little Red Riding Hood and the grandma ultimately defeating the wolf in that second encounter, are removed entirely, so that the grandma and Little Red Riding Hood are now simply the passive recipients of the huntsman's heroism. This leads into the reactions that we see in our final literary version for this week. And that's Terayama Shuji's reflection or reaction to Little Red Riding Hood. Terayama wanted to expose both the darker implicit messages in canonical fairy tales and look at the way these are being used to, as he says, acculturate children. To this end, Terayama wants to disrupt our expectations and our readings of the traditional tale, and he begins by doing that with his format. Look at this, just scan your eye down the page. How is this formatted? Is this how fairy tales looked in the books that you saw as a kid? Not at all. It looks like a standardized test, right? It's familiar to us, but it's not familiar as a fairy tale. And it even has the language that we see and the text box, all the things that we associate with the standardized test. What is that saying? Because it has a message there. Is it saying that fairy tales have become these standardized messages that are very rigid, that we're being forced to sort of learn and accept the way we have to learn and accept material for any standardized test in order to get the right answer and be rewarded? Because notice he has classified himself as a headmaster, and that there is both reward and punishment based upon how you fill out these questions, how you are able to reiterate the story that you have been given and are supposed to accept. But is this the story that we have been given? When we look at the different places where we're supposed to choose text to fill in the blanks, the text that we've been offered by Headmaster Terayama is not the text of the Perraults and Grimms that we're familiar with. No, instead, let's look at this just first sentence. The beautiful boy, first of all, the protagonist is now a boy, not a little girl, is adored by the one, and here are options for one. Sandman, the Kentucky Fried Chicken Colonel, the old woman who was afraid of being killed by her grandchild. None of these are in any version of Little Red Riding Hood that I am familiar with. Terayama has offered them to us perhaps to push the absurd with the Kentucky Fried Chicken Colonel, or perhaps to dig into the darker, possibly psychological messages, that maybe this isn't a story about just a little girl learning about threats, but about tension between the grandparent and the grandchild. Perhaps the wolf represents more animosity than we understand. Not an outside threat, but an internal one. When Terayama leaves these choices to the reader, he forces them to think about the tale in a new way. Also forces them to engage with it in a new way, because now you are an active participant in storytelling, not just a passive recipient of the knowledge. And so in some ways, the very standardized format, which is suggesting that these tales are standardized and fed to us, is actually forcing us to become active and rather than passive. Think about the answers. Think about the implicit messages. By changing the protagonist to a beautiful boy who is being threatened, is that both challenging and exposing the traditional emphasis on women or girls being the only victims of predators? And instead, there's little boys are just as vulnerable, and pointing out that's a story we don't like to tell. Instead, we'd rather tell it about a little girl. What does that mean? What does that say about us? These are the sort of things that Terayama's Little Red Riding Hood is bringing to light. So same story, dramatically different way, new messages. After reading these, have you had any new thoughts about fairy tales or about the potential that fairy tales have to send dramatically different messages and tap into messages that we've received and perhaps never thought about before?